Okay, so I want to quickly go over this week's cybersecurity notes. And I'm going to do a little bit of a deeper dive on one of the papers that I read this week, just so you don't have to, just to make your life easier. That's all. And so I think one of the things that's different about this little mini video podcast and other podcasts is it is a little bit where policy and technology intersects. But also, we have the ability to include amazing stock photos, in this case, of a team of hackers planning a big cyber attack on corporations around the world. That's the literal, when you download it, that's what it's called. So I thought that was really funny, because that's exactly what they look like. So let's get right to it. Spending some time with real modern tools that are not that commercially popular is, I think, one of the ways you can figure out what's going to happen in 5 years. And one of the things that I keep trying to explain to the policy world is that if you're not projecting ahead of time, then your policy is actually hurting your national strategy, because you have to start working. Software is so hard, and getting it right takes forever. Getting it into the marketplace takes forever. It's true even in government software. So you need to start preparing now for the stuff that's supposed to come. But if you don't have any visibility on what's about to come, then you might as well give up. So I want to point out a couple things. One, it's good to have metrics. Two, it's also good to know if your metrics are any good. And I think this was just a really funny post. But I also think Insanity Bit here is building a company called Grapple, and someone asked me recently, they're like, I'm an incident responder, I want a new challenge, what should I do? And I'm like, well, why don't you take a quick look at Grapple and see what you think? Because if you were going to build a modern incident response product, it would not look like the ones people have deployed today. It would be really different. First of all, it would probably be cloud native. Right? So it would have built-in scalability. And second of all, it'd probably have a graph database underlying it and work in a very different way. So I think, you can kind of look at the signatures that people are trying to produce for the incident response tools they have now, and you can say, that is a lot of juggling just to figure out if two things that happened are correlated. Is there any way to do that other than one thing happened first and the second thing happened second on the same machine? Or can I connect them via some natural method, like it's actually spawned this process for sure, right? So there's a lot that I think you can learn by trying to figure out what the new technologies are going to be. How is stuff going to have to evolve? So that's one area. The other one that I've been looking at a lot is Techtrain. They actually are having Thursday. They're doing something in terms of test demo, and you can script stuff. And what Techtrain is, as far as I understand it, is sort of hypervisor plus debugger. It sort of records everything that an entire virtual machine does, and then allows you to replay it and trace data as it goes through the whole system. And one of the hackers that I'd hired a while back had a really unique capability to understand user space and kernel space at the same time. So all the vulnerabilities he found, it was sort of where other people would stop when they hit a system call, his brain kept going and into the details of the system call and then back out. And when you're looking for bug classes that are a little bit more complex, this is just how you handle it. That you just have a complete view of everything. And what I see here is the software advancing into that space as well. And it's very interesting. I think it's well worth a look. They have free cloud version on Thursday. So if you're the kind of person who's like, hey, I need to know the future so I can prepare for it, that's the kind of thing I'd be doing. Let's talk a little bit about policy and papers you might have missed. First thing, bad cyber policy bingo. I'm going to zoom in a little bit because I don't think it understood that I wanted to do that properly. But I posted this to Twitter. And I feel like you should use this when you're reading a paper or a book or watching a talk or any of those sorts of things where you're just going to get just a lot, a bunch of very basic stuff. I put public-private partnership in the middle as a free spot because that one's in everything. But If you get bingo on someone's paper, then I'm not saying that's a bad sign, but it's not like a good sign. Let's put it that way. They're not really advancing the thought. Like, are these good ideas? No, these are all bad ideas, pretty much. I put in cyber weapons arsenal stockpile, and what I did that was like people want to restrict how many exploits you have, which is dumb. People are like, why can't we just fix the code we use? That's a dumb thought. Don't think like that. Would more UN GGE meetings solve any of our problems? Maybe. I don't know. So in general, like, you could or could not make something of any of these ideas, but you probably didn't, is kind of where I go with that. Anyway, so next stuff, Journal of Intelligent History. I didn't know this journal existed. There's a lot of journals I didn't know existed. I read a lot of papers in a lot of different sort of spaces, usually biology papers, but also these sorts of papers. And I want to go over this particular paper later in this excitement. Okay, so moving from a whole of nation to a whole of alliance approach. I was listening to like an admiral do a podcast today while I was running. And I just love the way they always talk in these stupid, trite, like, phrases. And I thought I started making up phrases in my head that I thought they might say. And so anyway, this is one of the ones that I just thought up and I thought it was really funny. Okay, so I like if you're going to defend forward, you might as well brick some mining machines. That saves the environment. It probably stops them from funding whatever cyber offense you can fund with half of a Bitcoin or whatever it is. So I thought that was really funny. Again, I don't think people have really put the Emotet botnet action into good policy frameworks. I don't think they've seen, like, I think they sort of see it and it's just like a point in time and that's that. I think if you look at what you are going to do when we say we need to protect some of our infrastructure or we need to protect the private industry, then obviously we started out by like we would see stuff and we'd warn people, be like, oh my gosh, you guys are all getting owned by like Mirai that some 14-year-old wrote and he put out there on the internet. Oh my gosh. And the problem is our policy frameworks did not have the capability to go out there and remove it. So it's out there, it's on someone's home thing, it's causing trouble, it's not their fault, but we still can't do anything about it. So let's say we figure out a way to like remove it using, you know, both policy and technical. There's a whole bunch that fits together there. And then later you're like, okay, we removed it, but then they rebuilt it right away because that device is still an ancient IP camera and they just hacked it again, right? So now we're like, oh, we got to remove it and we got to patch it. And maybe there's no vendor patch. So we got to start building our own patches and just putting them out there. Or we can just remove it and then just brick the device and be like, well, you had a vulnerable IP camera and we just didn't think that was going to be a problem for the rest of us anymore if we bricked it. And so we have to start figuring out like what are the policy areas that we need to build now that are going to allow us to do what is the obvious next step, which is preemptively hacking into things and then patching them up and then leaving. And that seems very simple, but obviously I don't think we're there yet. I think the Dutch might be getting closer than we are. And again, this is just a funny one. If you missed it, she's doing the little dance and there's like a coup going on behind her. And Jamie's like, look, 100% protection against threats while they're getting popped by the same threat. I just thought it was really funny. Okay, so I want to do a quick review of this paper. And because I just think some papers are important and you should read them, but you probably didn't. And I want to point out a few things in them that you could just quickly understand, and then you maybe aren't going to read the paper, so it's fine. First thing first, there's like a little abstract. I don't find abstracts in this kind of paper that useful. Maybe in any paper, they're not that useful. Actually, in biology papers, they're usually a lot more useful than policy papers. So if we, like in the theory, like if we go over what does it look like when you build a technological edge and then your adversary wants to erode that edge using espionage, or as we call now, cyber hacking. Here's what you can see from the declassified literature. So that's why I like this paper, right? Like, so it's like a bunch of declassified literature, real world studies, link to our present. Simple, right? So, the Soviets had some issues when building modern technology. They had failures, but they also had successes. I want to go down to what I thought just some of the best paragraphs in here. You can learn about the history, blah, 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 blue. I like the joke. Nice jokes. Okay, so some of it, it's just history. Good stuff, but still history. Let's go through here. It's not just about how they got the information, it's about how you know that they got the information, which I thought was very interesting. And you also get in this history a little bit of, certain people in their bureaucracy were just like confused and it held them back. You know what I mean? And we have the same issues here locally. We have people who were very good at nuclear who are not good at cyber, and so forth. Okay, so I think one of the first things I really liked is he starts talking about not just the hardware that they were building, but what software frameworks they were building on top of that they were trying to sort of correct for the deficiencies in their hardware, but also just because they had to do that, right? It's an interesting corollary if you look at how the Chinese are building their own deep learning frameworks that work on top of Huawei and Baidu chipsets and optimize for what they need to optimize for, and in some cases probably better than what we have that would work on their stuff, right? So it's comparisons with TensorFlow. So it's a very interesting space and a very interesting way to think about it. So obviously, one of the questions you have is how do you apply some of this technology to things that are commercial versus things that are military and government, which is something that came up here quite a bit. Okay, so I wanted to know, 40 assets, is that a lot of assets? Is that no assets? I don't know, but I think if you just think about it as a scale problem, I need to run 500 assets in order to catch up in microprocessor design, then I think the Chinese would be happy to do that. They're like, okay, cool. We need 500 assets. That's X million dollars times 500. I don't know, right? So it's sort of like, what's the scale of the threat? Hence, how much do we invest and how do we invest in counterintelligence? And it's funny also that a lot of the companies that they talk about don't exist anymore, right? So the important companies may not be around for that long, which I thought was pretty interesting. And the important technologies have changed quite a bit from what they used to be. You don't hear about mainframes too often anymore. Right here, in fact, it's split over these pages, and so you might miss it. So he's like, it's sometimes very difficult for someone in the government to understand the importance of a technological advance. And you'll get people in state or in commerce or in other places who are technical but not in industry who will say, this is super important. And part of that's because they're just not as exposed to the cutting edge of that technology. And I would say this is very clear when you look at artificial intelligence in the United States. We, for example, did a export control rule on geospatial imagery, and I think that's just a very clear example that when you have someone come in and say, oh, we've got this new amazing product, and you read off the marketing and it sounds amazing, you're going to think, oh, we better control this. Because it's hard for you to judge as a government person where that technology stands in the space of technological availability and path, right? So you may not realize there's a ton of foreign availability, or this is just basic stuff that everyone has, or it's basic stuff that people have decided to apply to the next obvious area. So it's like right in the technological path. And so you see this, and this isn't just American, you see this all over the place, European, American, everywhere else, where it's like they don't necessarily know that just because something is marketed as cutting edge, it's not necessarily cutting edge. And this is a problem that it's important to address when you start doing some technological policy properly. You know, here he's actually talking about, which I think is very interesting, is like people were very focused on the computation, but the networking and interconnect is just as important. And that's something that you also see with, for example, I'll bring it up again, AI chips, right? So we talk about AI chips all the time, but do we talk about the interconnectivity, the heat management, all that stuff when it comes to technological advances? How do we analyze these things? How do you even compare them? Very difficult, right? So sometimes what we're comparing is the least relevant part of the system because we can compare it in flops as opposed to how do you interconnect and what's the mesh look like across an AI system. So that's something you will see quite a bit. Boom. All right, so I want to go over the conclusion. There's a lot of stuff in the conclusion. It's dense. And this is where he ties all of the historical stuff into modern day problems that we're having right now that are very important and we need to address. And one of those problems is that we're constantly focused on counting how many campaigns or how many C2s, how many exploits, how many implants, all that stuff. Stop counting everything and start analyzing what's going on is a very important pressure that we need to start applying because we're really not. And one of the issues with why we're not doing that is that a lot of the analysis that's getting done by the incident response teams is getting done by private industry as part of their customer mission, right? So they have customers, and then we, in terms of the entire community, have to feed on all of these little pieces. So there's not even a single point of contact as a name of any of the adversary organizations. So like we can't say, like we're going to say Fancy Bear, for example. Well, what groups of campaigns does Fancy Bear fit in? There's no single name between two different incident response firms. The government just picks whatever it feels like, or you have to say Fancy Bear / APT 5005 / Zinc / whatever. So like all those things don't even mean this. They're not even in the same categorized sections, right? So like when Microsoft says Zinc, that doesn't necessarily have the same ability differentiation of scale. And so I think some of this stuff, like NIST or some other CISA, somebody needs to get on figuring out how to coordinate properly. That's something he doesn't even dwell on in this paper. There's other things that dwell on, one of which is understanding innovation is different from understanding technology, right? So like it's just a very difficult thing to get forward to organizations, especially those that look at export control of technology, right? But you need to focus on the future. The future is innovation. How does this all fit together? All of that stuff is in this conclusion. It's a really good conclusion. It's really worth reading. So I hope everyone does that. I hope I've given you enough out of this paper that you feel like you can go and approach the paper very quickly and just understand it. Just absorb it. Just absorb the brain that's in this. How are you going to unpack innovation and be able to change the calculus of an adversary's environment? Like all this stuff, he's hinting at the future of like the next paper, the next thought. I would say these are problems we have in the present, and they are pressing problems. And reading this paper is here to help you understand some of where those problems came from historically and kind of where they are right now. So thank you so much for listening to all of this. I know that some of my commentary is, of course, incoherent. But some of it's not. Some of it hopefully let you think. And I will see you next week.